You've read it out, but I'm curious, how exactly are the battles taking place and what tactics are the Russians using now?
For the most part, their tactics remain the same, but with some adjustments, let's say, to account for the specific features of combat in certain areas. For example, what has been particularly relevant and noteworthy over the past few days is that our airborne assault troops have been actively pushing back Russian military units out of the industrial zone and the city center. The train station and are holding positions along the railway. In other words, there are signs of stabilization in the fight to hold the northern part of the city, preventing the enemy from consolidating in the areas they've already entered. Another important and ongoing issue, which is a critical task and remains persistent, is ensuring the continued maintenance of logistical supply routes. They remain to the north of Pokrovsk, and fighting continues in the area of Krasny Lyman and further west. This remains very important, and it is indeed a crucial element to the prospects of further holding Pokrovsk and, in general, the Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad agglomeration. Recently, the enemy has successfully managed to reach the outskirts of the city of Mirnohrad, as well as Novo Ekonomichne from the east, south, and north. This means that fighting continues in Dobropilya, primarily in order to cut off the logistical supplies to our defenders, who are operating both directly in Pokrovsk and in Mirnohrad. However, from the information you have provided, we see that they are not only limited to active offensive attempts in this agglomeration, but also steadily increasing the intensity of combat operations and making tactical advances in certain directions around Kostiantynivka. That is, this defensive line, Kostiantynivka, Drushkivka, Sloviansk, and Kramatorsk, remains one of their most important objectives. There is absolutely nothing new in terms of the fact that if they succeed, as they themselves declare, in capturing the Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad agglomeration, then the main operations are being planned and preparations are already underway to seize areas along this line. In addition, as we know, there has been an intensification in the Zaporizhzhia direction and on both flanks, specifically in the Orikhiv area, directly along the Orikhiv axis. The enemy managed to capture Kamyansky and is advancing further upstream. And now fighting is taking place around Stepnohersk and even further north of Primorsk. For now, our forces are repelling the attempts of the enemy to encircle Stepnohersk from the flanks. And fighting is also ongoing on the outskirts of Primorsk. There is a small road leading directly from Stepnohersk, and of course this is of interest. In Zaporizhzhia, it's 25 kilometers. This situation is quite unsafe. And then there's the separate direction of Huliaipol. They have come quite close and are trying to encircle it further. Although there are prospects for our units to conduct combat operations there, the issue is resources. Because the enemy has entered what is called a lull. There's probably no point in going into detail here. Everything will be decided in the coming days. However, in the Huliaipol direction, we managed to halt the enemy's advance. And here, fighting is still intense and heavy battles continue. Kupiansk, which, along with Pokrovsk, has already been repeatedly declared encircled by Russian propaganda, is holding out. Our forces are conducting combat operations are ongoing in the northwest, in the west, and in the city itself. Fighting is taking place for the center. And a separate direction is the bridgehead to the east of the river, which is quite difficult to supply logistically because everything went through Kupiansk, the bridges, and there are certain crossings there. But carrying out these logistical tasks is difficult, and this in turn complicates the effective conduct of combat operations. For those units and divisions that are operating here on the bridgehead, Moreover, the enemy is trying to cut it off in the area of Peshana and either eliminate or capture this bridgehead. That is why the fighting here is also very intense. In the Dnipropetrovsk region, Ukraine's defense forces are halting the enemy's advance. They continue to persist in acting according to their previously established plans, following them as intended.
Igor Alexandrovich, I would like to discuss with you how you interpreted this to get your comments on why this is being done. But it's clear that the informational component is one of the most important in this confrontation with Russian aggression. Still, before this, the Russian side, let's call it that, and even the General Staff of the Russian Federation, they were saying that in principle the issue around Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, Volchansk, Yampol has been practically resolved. Yes, Russia has captured everything, and these reports were being presented in a friendly manner to the top leadership of the Russian Federation, as if these problems for the Russian army have already been solved, although we understand that this is not the case. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine has officially denied the corresponding statement and information coming from our adversary. Igor Alexandrovich, how do you see this? What is the purpose of these fabrications? But if the situation really isn't as they claim, then why is all of this being done? Is it that people in the General Staff are somewhat afraid for their positions, their ranks, and accordingly their standing within the structures of the Russian Ministry of Defense and the General Staff?
That's certainly part of it. We know that even Gerasimov himself, during this stage of the large-scale war, was removed from his duties several times, only for Putin to reinstate him afterward. So this does happen. But here the question is about the significance, for example, of Pokrovsk itself and holding it at this particular moment. It has such global importance because, as is known, negotiations are underway. Work of the American-Ukrainian delegation on a version of a so-called peace plan, which was primarily prepared by the Russians. And there was even a scandal in the American Senate over this. This plan was handed over. In other words, it didn't originate in the Trump administration, but was developed by the Russians with their own approach and then handed over. We can see it. The Americans' ultimatum-like content, which now, well, Trump says that it's not final, that it can be worked on, and that's what the delegation is doing. So, returning to this situation, at the same time they propose such a plan, the Russians justify their positions, the ones reflected in the ultimatum-like points, by saying that these issues have already been resolved. Resolved where? On the front lines? That's why the current state of affairs is very important. The objective situation as of today to show and defend what our Ukrainian Defense Forces are doing and to disavow such portrayals for the Americans coming from the Russians. This work is being carried out thanks to the heroic actions of our soldiers on the front lines and particularly in this regard. That is Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, those places that, according to Russian propaganda, were surrounded, already eliminated, or captured a month ago. There is also an information war of a global scale going on.
Yes, absolutely indeed. The information war is now gaining momentum like never before. And it really is important to talk about the successes of the Ukrainian army. Here's an interesting case that happened recently. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces shot down a Russian Mi-8 helicopter on Russian territory for the first time using a deep strike drone. This happened during a drone attack on targets in the aggressor country, legal attacks. And the Special Operations Forces also noted that this is exactly how they are changing the rules of the game. Because from now on, Ukrainian drones are now hunting Russian helicopters, which the Russian occupiers launch in attempts to shoot down the drones with which Ukraine is attacking legitimate targets on the territory of the Russian Federation. How would you assess, let's say, the strategic future resulting from such successes, from such skills of the Ukrainian army?
Very positive innovation from the Special Defense Forces, although it should be noted that attacks by our drones have also been carried out by units from other branches of the Defense Forces. We know of successful attacks by Ukrainian maritime drones, which carried appropriate weaponry, approached and struck their targets. So In principle, drones are destroying helicopters, but these are different types of drones, and this has indeed happened. But in this particular case, with this type of drone targeting helicopters, and as you can see, they're being hunted, these operations were carried out on our side in the locations where these Mi-8 helicopters were stationed. It can be used both as a transport and as a combat helicopter. And the paradox is that the Russians use this widely, especially in fortified areas, such as around Moscow and the Moscow region, where there are 3 rings of air defense and detachments, helicopter units that carry out missions to destroy our drones. That's why there's a message here from the Ukrainian Defense Forces that a new stage has begun. Who is hunting whom is a big question. And we are already beginning to see the very first tangible results of such countermeasures, which, as a direct consequence, have led to the destruction of a highly expensive enemy Mi-8 helicopter.
Igor Alexandrovich, if we're talking about expanding the capabilities of the Ukrainian Defense Forces to eliminate legitimate targets for our state on enemy territory, and accordingly, possibly in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine as well. Here, the head of Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Forces, Robert Brody, reported that there were new strikes on, let's say, a target on the territory of temporarily occupied Crimea. If we're not talking about deep strikes into Russian territory, but rather about how the defense forces operate toward the Crimean Peninsula and what prospects such strikes should open up. When command posts, systems, and those infrastructure facilities that essentially sustain the military machine of the occupying country on the territory of the temporarily occupied Ukrainian peninsula are being taken out.
The prospects are primarily connected to carrying out strikes and their combination. This is very important because here the situation differs when it comes to striking temporarily occupied territories, military targets, and targets deep within the Russian Federation. On temporarily occupied targets, we use both missiles, missile drones, and various types of strike drones, whereas mainly our drones operate deep within the Russian Federation. This means that the warheads, well, not exactly the ones we would like, although they are working as is, and we can see how. The only thing is that recently ATACMS have been added to attacks deep inside the Russian Federation, and this is very important. In other words, the Russians have lifted the restrictions. Maybe not everyone paid attention to this, but it is an important step. The Americans have lifted the restrictions on striking military targets deep inside the Russian Federation. In other words, the potential is increasing, especially at military sites in temporarily occupied territories. Here, the potential is growing due to both an increase in quantity and quality. That is, these means are being modernized. Which ones? Are various types of strike drones, and missiles used during attacks. In other words, combat operations are being developed. With the preparation of such operations, including airstrikes, before this, corridors are breached in the enemy's air and missile defense system in Crimea, and then airstrikes can be carried out most effectively